Okay, so it's 10 o'clock and now we are going to start with opening prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for waking us all up this morning. Thank you for continually being with us and for our guardian angels. Thank you for this message and allowing us to be able to understand it so that we can begin to teach it. And please give us clear understanding so that we can take it to the Levites and the Nethinims. We love you. Thank you for first loving us. Amen.
Amen. So, welcome everybody to Youth Prophecy Group. Today is July 26, 2020, and this is meeting number 41. And we are the Fucuses.
So now it is quiz time. And like we usually do, this quiz will be about the previous week's lesson. Question number 1. What does the first mountain in Daniel 2 represent? So when I say first mountain, I mean the mountain that the stone came from. And Eric, what does that first mountain represent? G. So Eric says G, which is the SDA church. Everybody else can answer now. Okay. I'll repeat the question. So what does the first mountain in Daniel 2 represent? It's also the mountain in verse 45. What does that mountain represent? So the answer is G. Mary just said G. So yes, that's correct. The answer is G, the SDA church. Question number 2. This question is to the Coleman family. What does the stone in Daniel 2 represent? Eric says E. So to repeat the question, what does the stone in Daniel 2 represent? And this question is to the Coleman family. So they say I. And now everybody else is free to answer in the next few seconds. Mary says H. Okay, so we have E, I, and H. And the answer is E, priest and Levites. The mountain is the SDA church, and the people cut out of the mountain are the priests and Levites. Question number 3. What does the mountain in Matthew 16 represent? This question is to Mary. What does the mountain in Matthew 16 represent? Eric says B. So to repeat the question, Mary, what does the mountain in Matthew 16 represent? Mary says B. And everybody else can answer in the next few seconds. Okay, so that is correct. The mountain in Matthew 16 represents God. What does the stone in Matthew 16 represent other than Christ and Peter? So we saw that the stone represents Christ, it represents Peter, and it also represented one other thing. So what is that one other thing that it represents. It was also the third application, if you remember them in order. And this question is for Stephen. What? Oh,
Olivia.
yeah. Oh, Olivia. So Olivia's connecting audio. Okay, so now that Olivia is here, this question is for you, Olivia. What does the stone in Matthew 16 represent other than Christ and Peter? And Eric already said L, or is that I? Yeah, that's I. So Eric says I, but Olivia, what do you think this stone in Matthew 16 represents other than Christ and Peter? She says L as well. Oh, I keep saying it looks like an L, but it's actually a capital I. Yeah, it's I, sorry. And Mary says I as well. The answer is H. It's other than Christ and Peter, and Jesus is Christ. So it couldn't have been Jesus. But anyway, the answer is H, which is us or God's people. And final question. Since the mountain, which is God, can't become a building, which we said was a church, what does God have to use? And this is for everybody to answer. So, well, all the questions are for everybody, but nobody in specific has to go first. Is this already? So Eric's
question.
Yes. So the question is, since the mountain in Matthew 16 is God, and mountains can't become buildings or churches, what does God have to use to build his church? Eric has said J. Mary says J.
J.
So Soraya says J. And Olivia says J. And is that it? Okay. So the answer is J, us. So God has to use us to build the church because a mountain cannot build a church. Congratulations. Oh, well, congratulations, everybody. We accidentally forgot the congratulations slide. That was not purposeful. We're not saying that you didn't get a perfect score. But congratulations, you got a perfect score anyway. That will be added immediately.
So the title of today's lesson is I Can't Breathe.
Okay. So in 2018, the study of the revolutions was opened up. In that study, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution, and the German Revolution were all lined up with our time, or our revolution. The Youth Prophecy Group did a study on the revolutions on November 3, 2019, but it was only half. We lined up the Civil War, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the German Revolution with our revolution. But we did not line up the American Revolution, the French counter-revolution, the Russian counter-revolution, and the German counter-revolution with our counter-revolution. This was because this movement did not know what will begin the counter-revolution. We did know it will begin in 2020, though. In this lesson, we will be reviewing the study of the revolutions, but this time we'll be doing part 2, the counter-revolution. So this is a slide we did. This is what we did on November 3, the study of the revolutions in the 9th of November. We did these waymarks in red, which is only part 1, the revolution. So in this lesson, we're going to be doing part 2, which is the counter-revolution. Do you want to say something?
Except that we didn't exactly do that French Revolution.
Yeah, I think we extended the French Revolution to 1799.
Yeah, there's two applications of the French Revolution. That's one of them, but we did the other one.
But
So
yeah, we
I said on the screen.
We did the other one, but we were considering it all as one revolution. So in the second perspective, we really only did the revolution. Even though we included the counter-revolution, we were really only saying it was just the revolution, if that makes sense. Anyway, we're going to be doing the counter-revolution.
The American Revolution is technically not the American Revolution, but
Yeah.
no, the American Revolution was actual revolution.
American Revolution not being the revolution in the 1700s, being just the revolution in America or the United States.
The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861. It lasted until April 9, 1865. The Civil War was fought between the north of the United States, which was the Union, and the south of the United States, which was the Confederates, over slavery, whether it should be legal or illegal. The South thought that it was a good thing, while the North did not. In 1865, America's deadliest war ended. Less than a week later, Abraham Lincoln, who had led the Union, was shot and killed. In 1865 lines up with November 9, 2019, although it's not 11/9 like the other revolutions, like we'll see later in the lesson. That is the Confederates surrendering to the Union. I don't remember which. I think the Confederates is on the right.
The people in the
Maybe.
gray.
Yeah. Robert E. Lee's Confederate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that's him. So yeah. Confederates on the right.
So the line of the American Revolution is different than the other revolutions we will look at. We saw that the first half of this line, the time period of revolution, is the American Civil War in the 1860s. But the second half, or the period of counter-revolution, is the American Revolution, the actual American Revolution of the late 1700s. We say the American Revolution is the counter-revolution which happens after the Revolution, even though the American Revolution actually happened before the Civil War. So it's sort of backwards in the way it happened, but not in the way we apply it. The American Revolution began with the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts on April 19, 1775. Those two battles happened while a British army was going to Concord to get one of the colonists' stockpiles of weapons, but the colonists had moved or hid them. The colonists first encountered the British army in Lexington. There were a few shots fired between the two groups, but no one knows for sure who fired the first shot. The British army continued traveling to Concord, and when they got there, they split up and some soldiers looked for the stockpile of weapons. While they were there,
No, keep reading.
Who did this?
What?
Battles of Concord and Lexington on April 9th.
While they were there, fighting erupted on the North Bridge, which was a bridge by Concord. Fighting erupted there between some more British soldiers and some colonists, and the colonists outnumbered the British soldiers. As the first shot, although it's not totally clear which side it came from, is called the shot heard round the world. As the British left Concord and retreated to Boston, although they stopped. As the British left Concord and retreated to Boston, the colonists followed them and continued to fire at them while they tried to defend themselves, so they ended up stopping at Charlestown. April 19th was the beginning of the counter-revolution for America. It was a year after 1774, the First Continental Congress, which is 245 years or half of the 490 from 2019. The counter-revolution always starts the year after the revolution ends. The revolution ended in 1865. Remember, the revolution in the history of the United States is actually the Civil War. We will see later that 1865 lines up with 2019, and 2019 is the end of the revolution. And since 1774 is also lined up with 2019, then we know that the American Revolution, which began in 1775, is the counter-revolution. The name Concord is another proof to the placement of this revolution that we will look at later. The battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775 marked the beginning of the counter-revolution when we look at American history.
Picture.
So this is a drawing of the Battle of Lexington.
Lexington. You couldn't get Concord.
Yes, and we accidentally had April 9, but it was actually April 19th, so you see it's fixed. In 1783, the American Revolution officially ended. The last major battle between Great Britain and America was the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781. At Yorktown, the British Army surrendered to the Americans and withdrew their troops. However, there were still troops around Charleston and New York, so there were small clashes between the two sides after that. On November 3, 1782, Great Britain and America signed a peace treaty and started negotiating the deals of a final treaty. 10 months later, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and this picture is of the Treaty of Paris. In the treaty, Great Britain officially recognized America's independence, and like I said, the people in the blue, I believe, is Great Britain, and brown should be the colonies. Britain also made major concessions, making this treaty exceptionally in the favor of America. Great Britain had failed in suppressing the new government, and with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the American Revolution officially ended. So, the American Revolution, which we mark as a counter-revolution, ended with the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783, which is this picture. So this is the line of the American Revolution. We see that even though the Civil War came after the American Revolution, we apply it as coming before it when we are looking at the revolution, counter-revolution perspective, and when we're looking at application. So American Civil War was the revolution. It ended in 1865 when Abraham Lincoln was killed. The American Revolution, which we mark as counter-revolution, started in 1775, which was the shot heard round the world at Concord and Lexington. That was April 19th. The American Revolution ended on September 3, 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, and that's where Britain officially recognized the independence of America, the colonists.
The French counter-revolution. The French Revolution from 1789 to 1799 can be broken into two parts. First is the work of the Jacobins. It began in 1789 and went until November 9, 1794. That period is what we call the Reign of Terror. It ended with the leader, Maximilien Francois Marie Isidore de Robespierre, was killed. He was killed on November 9, 1794. At the time, France was using the Julian calendar. In an attempt to obliterate God from society, they created the French Revolutionary calendar. The day Robespierre was killed was 9 Thermidor, the 9th day of the 11th month, or November 9. That ended the revolution and began the preparations for the counter-revolution. This is when Robespierre was killed. He was beheaded, I think. Yeah.
Really, this is a guillotine.
Although the revolutionary period of the French Revolution ended, the revolution as a whole was not over yet. The next year, a counter-revolution began. In 1795, many people began to fight back against what happened in the revolution, specifically the Reign of Terror. This is called the White Terror. It was mostly different small groups of people who had no central organization who conducted the White Terror. In contrast, the Reign of Terror was a government-controlled operation. In the French counter-revolution, People were arrested and killed mainly because of their involvement in the Reign of Terror. But some people were also arrested and killed for other problems that people around them had with them. The White Terror was just an excuse. In 1795, the beginning of the White Terror, which was the counter-revolution in the history of France, the French people rose up violently against those who had been involved in the revolution that had ended the year before. So the revolution ended in 1774, and the counter-revolution or the White Terror began in 1794, and the White Terror began in 1795. That's the only picture I could find labeled White Terror.
Really?
Well, there was another one, but it was weird.
The French counter-revolution ended on November 9, 1799. During the counter-revolution, the French government had been the Directory. The French Directory was a 5-member governing committee. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte staged the coup of 18 Vermeer and overthrew the Directory. In its place, Napoleon established the consulate. I think that's how you pronounce it. The consulate was Napoleon's new government. There was an executive branch and a legislative branch. The legislative branch didn't have much power and just gave automatic approval to the decisions of the executive branch without completely contemplating it. The executive branch, on the other hand, had power, which included drafting laws. In the executive branch, there were 3 consuls, and since Napoleon made himself first consul, he had all the power. So this picture is of the 3 consuls or consuls. Napoleon is the one in the middle because he's the most powerful. Basically, he had all the power of the government. Elections were a sham. Voters had no say-so. This new government was established in the Constitution of the year 8. So in 1799, the French Revolution ended with the establishment of Napoleon's dictatorship.
You said the elections were sham, but in Trump's words, they would be rigged.
Okay.
So this is Napoleon's new government, which basically gave him all the power, and he was a dictator. So the French counter-revolution ended with the setting up of Napoleon's new government, which made him the dictator. So this is the line of the French Revolution. We saw that the French Revolution ends on November 9, 1794, where the leader, Robespierre, was killed, beheaded. In 1795, the White Terror begins, which basically was the beginning of the French counter-revolution. That ended also on November 9, but 1799. So, and that's when Napoleon became a dictator. And this is also how in the other revolution study we did, we extended the French Revolution to 1799. But there are 2 different ways to see it. We can see it as one revolution, but in this case, we are seeing it as 2, revolution and counter-revolution. And the counter-revolution ends here.
The Russian counter-revolution.
Is this one?
Yeah. The Russian Revolution began on March 8, 1917, with strikes and protests. It lasted for several months and the Bolsheviks rose in power. Their leader was Vladimir Lenin. On October 25th and 26th, the Bolsheviks began taking control of government buildings. The following day, they seized control of the Winter Palace, which is what's in the picture. That's the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace was the major seat of government. That very day, Lenin became a dictator. The first thing he did was restrict the free press. During the Russian Revolution, they were using the Julian calendar. Russia was one of the last countries to convert to the Gregorian calendar. October 25th and 26th on the Julian calendar was November 7th and 8th on the Gregorian calendar. October 27th, when the Bolsheviks took control, was November 9th. The revolution ended on November 9th, 1917.
A year after the revolution ended in 1917, the Russian counter-revolution began.
Just again.
So Eric asked, what is the free press? So the free press is basically just newspapers being able to publish whatever they like, so they're free to talk, to say whatever they want. So by restricting the free press, he started monitoring what they were putting out, so everything that they said he would let them say in the newspaper
It was really the stuff
that he didn't like.
Yeah, he didn't like, because often the news likes to talk bad about the leaders. So if the leader wants to be good in everybody's eyes, or the people's eyes, they have to get rid of the press. That's what Putin did, and
That's what Trump did.
yeah, that's what Trump did too.
Did?
Yes, he got rid of the Washington Post out of the White House.
And he
And the
only
New
brought
York
It's
Times,
what he
right?
wished he could do.
He got rid of it.
He did it to
didn't
the
he?
best of his ability.
Yeah, but then he brought it back when they were showing he was acquitted in the
That's only
paper.
because he
Yeah, but they restrict the press that talks bad about them. Welcome.
A year after the revolution ended in 1917, the Russian counter-revolution began. The Bolsheviks had taken control of the Russian government, but many people didn't like that. Some socialists who didn't like the Bolsheviks, who also were socialists and communists. Some socialists who didn't like them, and other parties who didn't like the Bolsheviks either, combined to oppose the new government. They formed an army, and that army was called the White Army, while the Bolsheviks' army was called the Red Army. So you see the Red Army versus the White Army. The fighting between those two armies began in 1918. And that time, the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar Nicholas II. He abdicated in 1917, but they had taken him captive, and they killed him because they thought the White Army might try to free him. Also, in this time of counter-revolution, the Allies tried to help the White Army. The Allies being like Britain and France in World War One.
like the United States.
I guess the United States too. In World War One, because this is the history of World War One. So the Allies tried to help the White Army. They helped them mainly by sending them supplies. This time, beginning in 1918, is called the Russian Civil War and the White Terror, which is named after the White Army, and is also the Russian counter-revolution. So in 1918, the White Army started to fight against the Red Army, because the Red Army was the Bolsheviks, and lots of people didn't want them to be in power.
The Russian counter-revolution ended in 1922. The Russian counter-revolution was majorly a fight between the Red Army and the White Army, as we just saw. The Red Army was communist and the White Army was anti-communist, and Bolshevik and communist is the same thing.
Well, rather, the Bolsheviks were communists.
Mhm. At the end of the revolution, the White Army was defeated. This was partly because the White Army was divided, but the Red Army was more organized. The end of the revolution is marked with the formation of the USSR. The Red Army had successfully defeated the White Army, and on December 30, 1922, Vladimir Lenin, who was a communist and was one of the founders of the Red Army, formed the Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. Therefore, in 1922, the Russian counter-revolution ended with the establishment of the USSR. And this is the Soviet flag, and this is Lenin. Thinks he's a hero. Well, yeah.
What is that red?
I have no idea. Yeah, I think it's a. I don't know. Anyway. So this is the Russian Revolution. It ended on November 9, 1917. That's when Lenin became a dictator, and the Bolsheviks took control of the government. In 1918, which was the next year, the counter-revolution began, and the counter-revolution was between the Red Army and the White Army. On December 30, 1922, Lenin formed the USSR, marking the end of the Russian counter-revolution and the Bolsheviks being the winners, which is the Red Army.
The German counter-revolution. Why doesn't it work? The German Revolution only lasted a few days, however, it accomplished its goal. October 30th, 1918. On October 30th, 1918, there was a German sailor mutiny in World War I. They did this because their captain wanted them to purposely engage in a fight with Great Britain that they were 100% guaranteed to lose. Why die pointlessly? They rebelled against their captain and the common people joined them. The common person rose up because food was scarce. People were starving because of World War I. They wanted a change. Less than 2 weeks later, the Kaiser of Germany abdicated. He gave up the throne and fled to Switzerland, where he spent the remainder of his days. His abdication really wasn't supposed to happen when it did, but his own men turned against him, so he had no choice. His two options were abdicate and flee, or die with the crown atop his head. When he stepped down along with other high-ranking officials, the revolution ended. The German Revolution ended on November 9, 1918.
I think that's its crown.
So the German Revolution ended when the Kaiser abdicated on November 9, 1918.
Is that even the Kaiser?
Yeah, that is the Kaiser. I think so.
Following the period of revolution in Germany, there was a counter-revolution. It began in 1919, while the revolution ended on November 9, 1918. On January 4, 1919, some groups, including the Spartacists, which were communists, who opposed the new German government that had been established at the end of the period of revolution, planned a protest for the next day. On January 5th, many more people than they expected showed up. The protest was the beginning of the counter-revolution in Germany. It is often called the Spartacist uprising, and that's what the picture is. They were in a city protesting. I don't know. The government in the following days began to stop the uprisings, but there were other uprisings after the first one. Other groups tried to overthrow the revolution. January 5th, 1919 was the beginning of the counter-revolution in Germany.
The German counter-revolution ended in 1919. Communists in Germany didn't like socialist Friedrich Ebert. The first uprising was in January from the Spartacists. When that uprising was suppressed, other communists all over Germany began revolting and seizing power. One of those groups was the Communist People's Government. They took power in Bavaria, which is around a fifth of the land area of Germany. By May of 1919, the Freikorps had defeated all the uprising, and the army you see on the screen, the picture is of the Freikorps. The Freikorps were volunteer units for the military. Friedrich Ebert supported the Freikorps and they defeated the communists for him. There were many revolts, but by May of 1919, Friedrich Ebert had suppressed them, and hence the German counter-revolution ended.
And Friedrich Ebert is the person who replaced the Kaiser after he abdicated.
Mm-hmm. So the German counter-revolution ended when the Freikorps suppressed all of the revolts in May, and these are the Freikorps. So this is the German Revolution. It ended on November 9, 1918, when the Kaiser abdicated because he had no choice. And on January 5, 1919, the Spartacists began to revolt because they didn't like Friedrich Ebert, who had replaced the Kaiser. And the German counter-revolution ended till May when the Freikorps, which were working for Friedrich Ebert, suppressed all of the revolts. Did I say working for Egypt?
No.
Our counter-revolution. All the lines, the revolutions, and the counter-revolutions can line up with our revolution and counter-revolution. First, we looked at the American Civil War. It began on April 12, 1861, and ended on April 9, 1865. Next, we looked at the French Revolution. It began on May 5, 1789, and ended on November 9, 1794. Then we looked at the Russian Revolution. It began on March 8, 1917, and ended on November 9, 1917. Then we looked at the German Revolution. It began on October 30th, 1918, and ended on November 9th, 1918. All of those four histories can line up with our revolution, which began on September 11, 2001, and ended on November 9, 2019. And next, we looked at the American Revolution, or it's the counter-revolution on the lines, but it's called the American Revolution. It began on April 19, 1775, and ended on September 3, 1783. April 19th was the battles of Concord and Lexington. After the French, Russian, and German revolutions, there was preparation for the counter-revolutions, and the counter-revolution in France began in 1795 and ended on November 9, 1799. The counter-revolution for Russia began in 1918 and ended in 1922. The counter-revolution for Germany began in 1919 and ended the same year in 1919. Then that lines up with our counter-revolution, which after the revolution that ended on November 9th, there was preparations for the counter-revolution, and the counter-revolution began on May 25th, 2020, and ended in 2021. Why is it May 25th? Yeah,
I didn't make this. You did.
All right, you deleted the other copy. Anyways,
No,
it
this
began
was
in
the one
2020.
you made. Stop accusing me of something I didn't do.
September 11, 2001 was the beginning of the revolution in our time. But more specifically, what began the revolution was the Iraq War, which is what the picture is of. President George W. Bush tried to use the terrorist attacks of 9/11 as an excuse for a war against Iraq, telling people that the terrorists were from that country. But many Americans didn't believe him. Yet the United States went to war anyway. He also was trying to tell them that Iraq was at the weapons of mass destruction. That war, I think he was lying about Iraq, basically. It was more than one lie.
What I want to know is, they're in the middle of a war in this picture. Who's taking pictures?
Yeah. But many Americans didn't believe him, yet the United States went to war anyway. That war further divided the United States, both politicians and regular people, between Republicans and Democrats, mainly. Republicans were for the war, Democrats were not. A revolution and a counter-revolution happen inside a country. They are internal. The Iraq War permanently divided the U.S. This is one way we can mark the revolution as beginning at 9/11, because in 9/11, the country was permanently divided, and the two sides began to fight each other. A revolution began. Another phrase that is the same as revolution or internal is the Western Front. The Iraq War 2003 began the Western Front when we lined up our line with the line of World War I. So 9/11 and the events around the Iraq War in 2003 began the period of revolution in our time.
Where's my paragraph? I'm looking for my paragraph. Okay, I found it. The end of the Civil War, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and German Revolution all parallel 2019. We saw that 9/11 parallels the beginning of all three revolutions and the Civil War, making it the beginning of the revolution in our time. The revolution in our time is between Republicans and Democrats. From the Civil War, 1861 is 9/11. 1863, which is midway in the Civil War, is 2014, which is midway on our line. 1865 is the end of the Civil War, and that parallels 2019, which is the end of the revolution. So 1865 is the waymark after Midway. 2019 is the waymark after Midway. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln was killed, and this tells us that in 2019, a president will be killed. In the French Revolution, on November 9, 1794, which was the end of the revolution, Robespierre was killed. In the Russian Revolution, on November 9, 1917, which was the end of that revolution, the Bolsheviks came to power and Lenin became a dictator. And in the German Revolution, on November 9, 1918, the Kaiser abdicated. All of those were the revolutions, not counter-revolutions. They were the end of revolutions. The end of the Civil War, the end of the French Revolution, the end of the German Revolution, all parallel 2019. They tell us that in 2019, a leader will be killed or they will abdicate. The end of the Russian Revolution parallels 2019, and they tell us that, or that waymark tells us, that in 2019, a dictator will come to power. These are all about Trump. Those waymarks were the end of all those. Let me start. Those waymarks were all the end of the literal revolution or literal civil war. We are in a symbolic revolution or civil war. We can't take literal deaths, abdication, dictatorships, and groups coming to power and apply them literally to our time. We have to go literal to spiritual or literal to symbolic. So in 2019, Trump will symbolically die or abdicate, symbolically come to power as a dictator, and the Republican Party will symbolically come to power. This is a transition. In 2019, Trump as a president will symbolically end, and he will be transitioning to a symbolic dictator. The Republican The Republican Party will also come to power through the dictatorship of Trump, who is a Republican. This is the main point of the revolutions, the part one of the revolution. So quickly, we see that Trump, from the end of the revolutions, we saw that Trump will die as a president and resurrect or transition to a dictator symbolically in 2019.
From the line of the American Revolution, we can line up the battles of Concord and Lexington with the beginning of our counter-revolution. The beginning of our counter-revolution is also a Concord waymark in this dispensation, or the 2019 to 2021 dispensation, which is another way to connect it to Concord and Lexington. At the very beginning of the battle, a shot was fired that was called the shot that was heard round the world. This began the American Revolution. This shot brought all Americans together to fight for one common cause, break out of Great Britain's grip. On our line, when was this shot fired that could be heard around the world? On May 25, 2020, George Perry Floyd Jr. was murdered. He was black and he was killed by a white police officer over a fake $20 bill. The police officer, Derek Michael Chauvin, choked him to death with his knee. The guy's now in jail. George Floyd repeatedly said, "I can't breathe." His death brought together all people around the world to fight against common enemies, racism and police brutality. Protests broke out all over the world over this, and Trump has not been on the right side of these protests. Our counter-revolution began on May 25th, 2020.
This is a picture of the protest that started after the cop killed George Floyd.
It was of a protest.
Yeah, of one of the protests that started.
The end of the counter-revolution in our time is still future. There are two ways to look at when the counter-revolution ends in our time. If we consider the periods of revolution and counter-revolution as the Western Front, then we know that the counter-revolution will end in 2021. The Battle of Panem is the end of the Western Front according to World War I, and in World War I is Armistice Day, and according to World War II, where it's 1945. So the counter-revolution or Western Front goes until 2021. If we consider the midpoint, though, the end of the counter-revolution in our time is later. According to the lines of the Civil War and the first application of the French Revolution, which we did not discuss in this lesson, the midpoint pattern is 9/11, the beginning of the revolution, 2014, the midpoint, and 2019, the end of the revolution. But if we look at the second application of the French Revolution and the German and Russian revolutions, we can see that the period of counter-revolution, we can see the period of counter-revolution. And that scale, 9/11 is the beginning of the revolution, and 2019 is the midpoint, or the end of the revolution, because 2019 is midnight, which is a midpoint. And if 2019 is the midpoint, then the end of the counter-revolution has to be the Sunday Law, since 2019 is spiritually midway between 9/11 and the Sunday Law. Even according to the Western Front model of specifically World War I, although the fighting ended on Armistice Day, the war wasn't officially over until the Treaty of Versailles, which would line up with the Sunday Law. So, although the counter-revolution will end in 2021, it will not be fully over until the Sunday Law. We can learn that when we combine both models, the model of Western Front and the model of the midpoint.
So this is our revolution. On September 11, 2001, two sides were formed, which were Republicans and Democrats. They became polarized over the Iraq war. The Republicans wanted to go to war in Iraq. The Democrats knew that Iraq wasn't even responsible for 9/11, so they didn't want to go. Those two sides fought our revolution till November 9, 2019, when from the end of the revolutions, we saw that Trump would be killed, or Trump was killed or abdicated, and also became a dictator. The Republicans also came to power, and this is all symbolic. So he wasn't literally killed, and he didn't literally step down as president. He was symbolically killed and symbolically stepped down as a president and symbolically became a dictator. And the Republicans symbolically came to power. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd was killed. That's the shot heard around the world, "I can't breathe." And that began protests. And it was, we say it's Republicans versus Democrats. We can also see that some Republicans went on the side of the Democrats, but it's really the Democrats versus Trump, which is the Republicans.
What?
What?
You just said it wasn't Republicans versus Democrats, but it's really the Democrats versus Trump, which is Republicans.
What I mean to say is some Republicans went on the side of the Democrats, but it's mainly Democrats versus Trump, which is the Republicans. So it's Democrats versus Republicans. And that began the counter-revolution, which will end in 2021, where Trump will become more of a dictator and Russia will be defeated from the Battle of Panium. But we also see that the revolution won't really end till the Sunday Law.
So, in summary,
we're just gonna skip a lot because it's 10:52.
It's what?
no, it's
Your
not.
watch is
His watch
fast.
is fast. Okay, so we looked at these 5 lines. The American Revolution, not the literal American Revolution. We looked at, let's say, the Revolution in the United States. No. Okay, the Revolution in the United States, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the German Revolution, and saying those as a whole, not revolution and counter-revolution. Let's just say we looked at the history of revolution in the United States, France, Russia, Germany, and in our time now. So we looked at the periods of revolution. They all ended on November 9th, except for the Civil War. And then we looked at the periods of counter-revolution, which all began the year after the revolution ended, and they went for different lengths of time. We lined that up with our revolution. Our revolution began on 9/11, where we saw a permanent split between two sides in the United States. The revolution ended on November 9, 2019, where Trump was set up. The next year, May 25th, 2020, the counter-revolution began with attempts to stop racism, but stop racism. We can connect it to Trump, how they don't like Trump because Trump is rather racist.
Whatever.
It's an attempt to take down what happened in the revolution, which was the Republicans being more and more racist. And that's going to end in 2021 or the Sunday Law, whichever way you want to look at it. And one thing we need to know is that none of the counter-revolutions were successful. Except the American Revolution, it's different because it's two different histories. But in the French Revolution, well, that it doesn't really help with the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, a dictator is set up at the end. In the Russian Revolution, Lenin, who came to power on November 9th, was not overthrown. And in the German Revolution, Frederick, who came to power on November 9th, was also not overthrown. So Trump, as we know, he's the last president. Although he came to power on November 9th, in this story, he will not be overthrown at the end of the counter revolution.
We can see that the American Revolution was not successful if we say the Democrats was Britain and the Americans were the Republicans.
Democrats fired the first shot. You know.
What?
We don't know who fired the first shot.
Well, if we look at application, it would be the police against the people fighting against the police. So the United States was fighting against Britain, so that means Britain would have fired the first shot.
I don't get it. I still think
Because
America was
regular people that united to fight against the police, and Americans united to fight against Britain.
You could say it that way, or you could say it the other way, as Americans is the Democrats because Great Britain was the government. So we could say like the Democrats were the establishment that the Republicans were fighting against. No, that does not make sense. So the Republicans would be the government because that's Great Britain, the current government. But then that
doesn't work because the government lost in the American Revolution.
Yeah, so wait, that can't be right. So there's a problem.
Yes, my solution is
no, your solution's not right either. How? Because the police are going to win in our time, but Britain did not win in their time.
Please.
Yes.
Does anybody have any questions about this lesson or the message in general, not specifically about what we just discussed today?
Comments.
The American Revolution doesn't exactly apply with the people fighting and winning, but it applies as a revolution when we line up at our line.
There has to be some explanation.
Yeah. If anybody has an explanation, maybe they can say it or an idea.
You can type in the chat as well. Okay, if there are no comments or questions, share screen. Thank you everybody for coming. You can contact us at youthprophecygroup@gmail.com if you want notes, updates, or recordings. If you have questions, you can contact us there.
So, sorry for going a lot over time, but let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us another day of life. Thank you for opening up this study of the revolutions and help us to be able to remember it. Help us to remember what's coming in the future, and thank you for letting us be able to see that from the past. Thank you for letting us be part of the 144,000 and for letting us know what we have to do in the future and what high calling we've been called to. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So, bye everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.